Mark Austin was born in 1864 and he died in 1952, so his life spanned the whole period that you would call the entrance into the modern world. When he was born, there were no automobiles, there were no televisions, there were no radios, there were no telephones. None of this sort of thing even existed.
Mark's mother's name was Emma Grace and his father's name was John Austin. They got married when Emma Grace was 20 years old, and according to the records, they got married on her birthday. Shortly after they were married in that same year, Emma and John were living in England at the time, and some missionaries knocked on their door, and Emma listened to the missionaries and the message that they had. She prayed about it, and she, after doing so, knew that the church was true and asked to be baptized. Her husband, John, took a little longer. He wasn't sure of the truth of the message that they had and wanted to know for himself. It took him about 2 more years after Emma was baptized, and then he also received that same testimony. As the years went by, 18 years, Emma came to John and said that she had read where there was a steamship that was named Minnesota that was going to be coming from England to America, and she felt like they needed to get ready to immigrate to Utah, because at that time the prophet was indicating to them that they needed to come and gather in Zion.
In this family there were 17 children born, if you can believe it. 17! And amongst those 17, 5 died not as children, but actually as infants, and that left 12 children that lived until into their older years. And so Mark was amongst these, and he was number 9.
Grandpa was just 3 years old, going on to 4. He was about 3.5 years old, or a little older. And this was when this ship was going to come. It was leaving England in June of 1868. But John said to his wife, Emma, we can't go. We're too poor. We don't have the money. And Emma said, well, I believe the Lord will provide a way that we can go. About 2 or 3 weeks before the Minnesota was to leave, they still didn't have the money or the funds to be able to go. But one of their friends, who was also a member of the church, by the name of Turner, came to Grandma and said that they were going to go on the ship Minnesota and that they wanted them to come, and that her husband, this Mrs. Turner's husband, would not come unless John Austin would come with them. And she said, well, we would love to come, but we do not have the money. And she says, well, we can help you, and we will provide the necessary funds for you to come. And so they came across, and by August, they were in Utah and had settled in the area of Lehi. And they established a farm. There were a lot of boys, and so as a result, and they were good-sized men. Grandpa, I think, was around 6'2" tall, Mark, and his other brothers were also, they were big men. I would like to now go to Grandma, Mariah Brain Vaughan, who of course married Mark and became Mariah Austin. I'll start first of all with her father, who was Michael Vaughan. Michael Vaughan lived in the area of Wales. I think it was called Dingstow, Mansmouth, Wales is where he lived. And at the age of 27, he was single at the time, and we understand that he was working in some of the coal mines there in Wales. And some missionaries came to him as well, and he was very interested in the message that they had to share with him. After listening to their message, he then prayed about it, and with the influence of the Holy Ghost, knew that what they had told him was true, and he wanted to be baptized. He shared it with his parents, and they both indicated that if you do join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we will disown you and we will disinherit you. He still felt very strong that this was the truth, and he wanted to join and have the privilege of being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, and he went ahead and was baptized. And I want to now shift to Mariah's mother. Her name is Jane Mariah Brain, and she then was introduced to the church. Her family was introduced to the church in 1857. The missionaries came to their family, and They, as a family, listened to the message, and as a family, they joined the church. The mother, the father, and all the children that were old enough to be baptized were baptized at that time. Jane had an older sister that was old enough to come to Utah, and so they saved money and sent her to Utah to be there with the saints in Zion. So she came on her own and ended up marrying an individual by the name of Fox, and they ended up having a couple of children. Jane also wanted to come, and so when she was about 16 years of age, they then saved money so that she could come to Utah as well. And so she then came across, and she tells the story how she came with the Duncan company. She ended up doing a lot of walking across the plains and didn't have very good shoes, and it was hurt her feet, but she went through all she needed to get here. Then when she arrived here, the really only family that she had was this sister that had come earlier. The sister was expecting her third child, and just about the time that Jane arrived here, her sister then gave birth to this child, but both the mother and the child died. And so that left Jane really with no family here, and she was feeling very much alone as a 16-year-old girl. She ended up marrying Michael Vaughan. They ended up having 6 children. Of those 6 children, Mariah was the oldest, and they lived in Lehi.
Her and Grandpa grew up and played together as children. Grandma tells about when her and Grandpa were first married. Grandma was 22 years old, and after Hazel was born, Hazel was their oldest daughter, they moved away into their own home, which was 2.5 miles out of town. And it was still just a one-room home. She described it as a 14 by 16 foot room. And the first night they got there, I guess it was kind of late in the evening, and they started a fire in either the stove or the fireplace. I guess a spark must have gone out through the chimney, and in the middle of the night, her husband, Grandpa, opened the door and said, she said it looked just like lightning out there. And he said to her, "Oh, just go back to bed." And so they went back to bed, and the next morning she got up and they realized that all their clothes had burned. The sheets were burned, and the baby clothes were burned, and their underwear was burned, and everything. And you think, that was tragic.
She had to go out and get water from a well, and this well had 2 buckets tied to a rope on a pulley. She would lower one and pull it up with the other, bring the water up, and when she'd pull up, the first one would go down into the water and fell, and she could bring up a couple of buckets of water, and she had to carry them into her little cabin, and there she would have to heat the water over a stove, an iron stove, in order to get hot water for washing dishes or taking a bath or washing her hair or anything like that. And there was no indoor plumbing whatsoever.
She tells how this place they lived, she said, was a lonely place, and you sensed that it was hard. She tells how she'd go about 3 times a week to visit her mother and mother-in-law. You sense she was very close to both of them and loved to go there. She figured she'd traveled about 4,000 miles, no, it was about 3,000 miles in 4 years as she walked to town and back. And she would put Hazel with her baby, and she'd put Hazel in this buggy and push it along. And she said there was one spot that she had to go to, and it was a little creek. And she says sometimes it had a lot more water in it than others, but she says it was never such that even if she didn't take a buggy, she couldn't jump across it. She had to go through this creek. So she said one day she had been to visit his mom, and she'd stopped at the store and got a few groceries and put in this buggy, and she put it in the front part of the buggy, and as she got the buggy down in the water, why, I guess it just got all crooked, and finally it just dumped over. And the baby went in the water, and the groceries went in the water, and first of all, of course, she grabbed Hazel and got her out and put her in the road and ran back to get the groceries, and of course by then, she said the sugar had all melted, and the apricots she'd bought were just bobbing down the river. And she says, I just sat down and had a little cry and then picked myself up and went on home. They had another lovely little girl. She got whooping cough and passed away. So after this baby was born, then they had another little girl whose name was Ruby. And when they had that little girl is when they moved a little closer into town. What did they say? It was about a mile from town then. And this was kind of interesting. And now the home had a closet and a pantry. You notice they never mentioned bedroom.
Utah achieved prominence in the 19th century America for its efforts to produce sugar from sugar beets. LDS church leaders first attempted to produce sugar from beets in the 1850s. But although seed and heavy machinery were transported from Liverpool to Salt Lake City, much of the way by 52 ox teams, the factory never quite managed to solve the chemical problems of converting beets grown in alkali soil into granulated sugar. With the further development of the beet and its manufacturer, another attempt was made in the 1880s. In 1891, with the financial backing of the LDS Church, the Utah Sugar Company completed a $400,000 beet sugar factory in Lehi. Mark Austin and his brothers, George and Heber, were involved with the Lehi Sugar Factory from the beginning. Mark went to work there in 1890 at the age of 26.
And then 2 years later, Francis was born, and she described him as with the bright red hair, and he had freckles as he was growing up, and you could tell that he was a delightful little child that she truly enjoyed. There was a man in town that wanted to have their house and their property because he had a bunch of bees and wanted to get them out of town. They traded homes, and so Grandma and Grandpa and the 3 children moved into town, and Grandma says it was a lovely home, and she was so thrilled to be there. And it was right after this that he was called to go on a mission.
He would have been 31, I guess, when he was called on his mission. And he was married with 3 children.
And Grandma tells the challenges that she had in doing this. She actually had to go out and milk the cow and feed the chickens and take care of the fruit trees, pick the fruit, and help. She talks about help gathering the grain. You know, you think as the challenges moms have just keeping up with their little children now, and she had to keep this farm running, but she says they were very blessed and things went well. She commented that some of the children got sick and they dealt with that, but as a whole, things went well.
Mark Austin was a fantastic missionary in England while he was over there for 2 years, and had a lot of conversions. My wife, Gloria Day, has her ancestry coming out of England. As a matter of fact, her father was born in England and was converted to the church and came from England to the United States when he was a young man. And when he was in England, he had heard the name of Mark Austin, and indicating how well Mark had got to know all the English people over there, and they him.
And just before he came home, he wrote and wanted her to come and spend some time with him. And she really struggled with this. And as a mother, I can see how hard that would be. She had these 3 little children, and she just really said, I lost a lot of sleep trying to make the decision. And then finally she decided, and her mother agreed with this, that she would take care of the children. And Grandma Mariah Vaughan went and met her husband in England, and she was actually there. It said she went in May, and they didn't come home until November, so she had some real missionary experiences. And she said it was so good to be able to be with Grandpa, and I thought, what a neat opportunity at that point in her life to be able to go and serve a mission. Literally, she did. She said she got to go out and help teach and had some wonderful opportunities as a missionary. But she says, I was so thankful to get home, get back to my family and back to America.
While living in Afton, I happened to home teach a lady, a Sister Campbell, I believe it was. and I was surprised to learn that she knew Grandpa and Grandma. And in fact, I guess she and Grandma had been pretty close friends. Well, it turns out that when Grandpa came back from his mission, that this lady journeyed back to the East Coast to meet the ship. This lady's description was kind of graphic to me. As Grandpa came off the ship, having finished his mission, and as he came down the gangplank, her description of him was he was like a young god, which I thought was kind of high praise for anybody.
I ran across the patriarchal blessing that was given to Grandma Austin September the 8th, 1896. So she would have been, 31? We can all attest to the fact that these things were certainly part of her character. It says, "Thou shalt have great self-control, and be a tower of strength to thy husband, and thou art favored of heaven, and shall not want for food nor habitation. Thy children shall call thee blessed of the Lord. To thy increase there will be no end."
He accepted a call or a position with the agriculture department and was asked to go to Colorado. And so, of course, you know how it is. The men have to go first and get the job going, and the women have to stay and pack all the things and get there. And this was the case with her. And she got all these kids, and she had a baby. I don't remember who the baby was my dad. Michael was the baby. So she got the family on the train, and somehow they ended up taking a different route. I didn't understand all that, but they ended up at the Denver train station sooner than he was expecting them. So she gathered up her whole family and started into town and found this little restaurant and went in and sat down and looked up, and there came her husband, Grandpa, at the door. And so she called to him, and he came over and sat down, and they all ate together.
Mark really enjoyed working with the Great Western Sugar Company in Colorado. He was a very hard worker, and they had increased his salary several times, and they appreciated the work that he was doing.
And he was separated from the church, and the church was very important to him.
In 1903, he was offered a position by the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company to be the agricultural superintendent for them.
The guy said, "Well, why? Why do you want to do this? You know, stick with me, I'll make you a millionaire." Granddad said no. He wanted to go and be with the people of his religion, his people. And this guy's response was, "Religion's for old men and silly women." But which Grandpa remembered quite well.
And so he felt like this is the job that would be right for him. It wasn't as much money, and certainly didn't give him the opportunities that he had with the Great Western Sugar Company.
This guy did, in fact, become a multimillionaire, and it seems quite clear that had Grandfather stayed with him, he too would have been a multimillionaire.
Mark accepted the job with Utah-Idaho Sugar and moved his family to Idaho Falls. They lived there for just a few months, and then he found a place for them in Lincoln, which was just a few miles from Idaho Falls, where the sugar factory was actually located. While living in Lincoln, their youngest child was born, Robert. Then a few months later, they decided they needed another factory, and so they established another community a little bit to the north of Rexburg, Idaho. They called this new town Sugar City, and he moved his family there. And within a short period of time, they moved, just within a few months, they moved 3 times.
They were all on a train making a move. And they stopped, and he wanted to go get some peanuts for the kids. And she says, "No, don't get off this train, you'll get left." And he went anyway. He got off, took off after the peanuts, and of course you know the rest of the story. The train took off and left Grandpa in this little town, and so here's Grandma again with all the kids. When she gets to where she's going, she's got to get off and take care of all of them herself. And Grandpa, he finally finds somebody, I guess, with a buggy and brings him on in. He makes it a couple hours later.
He was known throughout the whole West for his interest in the sugar beet industry primarily, and that's the reason they moved from Lehigh up to Idaho, was to start the sugar plant up in Sugar City.
But Grandpa actually laid out the city of Sugar City and in the plan for the sugar beet factory, and that's how he laid the roads out and everything for Sugar City.
He set up the bylaws of the city as they got this city organized, that if anybody opened a saloon or a house of ill repute or anything like that, that it automatically became property of the city.
My grandmother had these two little Welch ponies that they'd hook up to a little surrey, and she'd take the kids where she needed to, shopping or whatever. And the story is that those two little ponies were quite mischievous, and when they would go to cross the creek, they'd stop right in the middle of the creek, and whatever she would do, she couldn't get them to go, and they'd sit there and paw around in that water, because I guess it was hot, and they just soaked everybody.
She says these horses just went like mad. They scared her to death. I guess the first time she got in, she wondered if she was going to live through it. She tells about one time coming back to the house, and I guess these little ponies would just take off like mad. The closer they got to home, the faster they ran. And so one time she had, and it was probably one of the first times she took them out, she had Francis with her, and he was 8 years old. And they took off. And so she yelled at him and told him to sit down in the bottom of the buggy so he didn't fall out, because she couldn't control them. They were just taking them back at their speed and the way they wanted to. And she says, I looked down at him and he had these freckles on his face, and he says his face was as white as snow, and these little freckles popped out all over, just like mushrooms all over his face. But she said, we made it back and nobody got hurt.
Grandma really quite enjoyed moving at quite a fast pace with those two little ponies pulling that carriage, and gave various people quite fun rides sailing across the countryside.
Grandfather went through a panic, that is an economic panic, like the Depression, only worse, in the late 1800s. And a lot of bad things happened to people at that time, and that's probably where Grandfather got his experience in how you deal with hard times.
In 1896, Grandpa was called to be the bishop of the Sugar City ward, and he served in that position until 1898.
He had I believe it was an uncle who was quite wealthy. He had, at that time, he had about $9 million, which in today's money is like 500 to 900 million. The guy lost it in 6 months, and it killed him. This Grandfather told me this story, I think to illustrate to me that, hey, money is really kind of a fleeting proposition, and it's not all that important.
He was called to be a counselor to President Thomas E. Bassett in the Fremont Stake Presidency. Served there for until 1910, when he was called to preside over the stake as the stake president.
So he was stake president for I don't know how many years. Most of the years that Mom was growing up.
Here's an interesting article about Grandpa in the Rexburg Journal that was written in February of 1915. Mr. Austin has made this country his home ever since the establishment of the sugar industry in this valley, and has taken a personal interest in its citizens. He rejoices at their good fortune, extends comforting words, and weeps with them in their sorrows, and is ever ready to extend a helping hand to the unfortunate or sound the keynote of reform to some miserable, sin-burdened creature.
She could speak, and she had the ability to project her voice so that she could fill an auditorium of quite large size long before there were amplifiers, and she could reach the people to the point that if she was telling something emotional, there was hardly a dry eye in the audience.
Then I remember Dad telling the story of Grandpa in Rexburg as a stake president. When they got ready to build the steakhouse, he got the plans from Payson, the Payson tabernacle, I guess it was, wasn't it? He was building a tabernacle up there in Rexburg as the stake president. He was kind of in charge of getting that going. And my dad always said that Grandpa, they told him how much they had to raise there in Rexburg, and then the church would supply the balance. And Grandpa said, no, we'll raise it all, we'll build that building. And so the story I heard was that they went ahead and built the steakhouse, or the tabernacle, which turned into a tabernacle. I think it was a steakhouse at that time. But anyway, they built it without any contribution from the church.
One Sunday they were having a conference with a lot of guests from Salt Lake General Authorities, one of them Brother Lyman. And so this Sunday he went early to conference, and she decided she'd stay home and fix dinner and get ready for him to come and eat. And about 1 o'clock, somebody brought a message in and says, the men are all going back to Salt Lake, none of them are staying, so hurry and come to the meetings. And so she got the kids all ready, and away they went over to the meeting. About halfway through the meeting, somebody brings her a little note down from her husband, and he says, they're coming to the house afterwards. The notes also said Brother Lyman wanted half milk and half cream and bread for his supper. So she jumped up and took the kids out, and as they went on their way, she just realized that she'd used all the milk making ice cream that she thought she was going to need, and she didn't have any. So she thought on the way out, well, I'll just have to go get that cow and milk it in the middle of the day. So as they hurried along their way, they got halfway home, and if you can believe it or not, the car ran out of gas. So they hitched a ride with a man that was going by with a load of hay, and they all climbed up in their Sunday duds. And when they got home, she sent somebody back to get the car, and she got a boy to go out and see if he could milk the cow to get some milk so that she could have this fixed for Brother Lyman. And finally he came with all his, and this is interesting, he came and it said he brought all the men he could get to come. So anyway, they said that they were able to get this all worked out. Brother Lyman was very happy with his supper, and all ended well, but she says, I was dog tired and half dead, but I went to bed and recuperated from it all.
One of the interesting things about Grandma was that she was the first woman in the Sugar City, Rexburg area of Idaho to learn to drive a car. Grandpa was the first man in that area to have a car, and she was the first woman to learn to drive. She was also the first woman to drive the car through the back end of the garage. And so
The Austin family had a great impact on the early history of Lehigh. And it indicates here perhaps the most famous of the illustrious Austin brothers was Mark. Learning the sugar business in the Lehigh Sugar Factory, Mark eventually advanced to assistant manager of Utah Idaho Sugar Company. He established plants in the upper Snake River Valley of Idaho, Lincoln and Sugar City, Colorado, Washington, Montana, and Canada. And so this was his life. He pushed sugar beets more than anyone else, I guess, and he knew how to raise crops and do those things. And I've heard many stories about his going out into the fields or just driving down the road and seeing a field full of sugar beets, and he'd turn his car off and drive off into the field of sugar beets and inspect them and look at them, check them, make sure they're doing things right. If they weren't, he'd get in touch with people and let them know.
One day they get in this little automobile, and he gets his two sons with him, Bob and Michael, and takes them out to a little farm where they're working. At this time, Michael, his son, that's my father, by the way, was just 8 years old, and he was just a just a small boy. And so off they go to this farm, and he gets heavily involved in talking with the farmers and about the sugar beets and how they should raise them and all that sort of thing. And it began to get late, and he says, Michael, why don't you take the car and drive it home? And Michael looked at him and thought, my, he wants me to drive that car home? Boy, this is going to be fun. So he was just 8 years old, so I guess he'd gotten the chance to practice just a little bit. So he and his brother got in the car, and off they went, 8 years old, tooling down the in their little Ford car. And as they went along, the car hit a nail or a board with a nail in or something on the road, and there was just BAM! And Michael thought for sure that somebody was shooting at him with who knows what, a shotgun or a rifle or something, and it just scared the bejeebers right out of him. And he hit the old accelerator, and away they went just as fast as they could go down the road in their little Ford car, and he took that thing home just as hard as he could go for a mile and a half or so, and he stopped it and jumped out and went into his mother and said, Mother, something terrible has happened. And she comes running out and takes a look at the car, and the back tire is just shredded all to pieces, and it had been punctured by this nail and blown up and made this big blast.
Well, I do recall one rather amusing incident, and I'm sure it was not the only one, because Grandpa had a one-track mind. I mean, if he went out to look at sugar beets, he went out to look at sugar beets. And I remember this one trip, he took Bob and Mike with him, and I think they'd gone from Sugar City down to Idaho Falls on business, and coming back, he stopped to look at some sugar beets and got all engrossed in what was going on. And the boys got out, and he got back in the car and drove home. And when he got home, Grandma came out and said, well, where are the boys? And his face dropped. He said, I left them in the field. And he had to go back and get them. Well, Grandpa was always very proud about his cars, and always had a nice big car, and he kept them up. They were special to him.
Grandpa was going down the road, and he also was law-abiding, and he had to signal. In those days, you didn't have the turn signals on the steering column like you do now, and so you had to put your arm out the window, and if you put it up, you're turning right. If you put it down, you're stopping. If you put it straight out, you're turning left.
But he'd get so engrossed in what he was about to do that he'd sometimes almost forget where he was, or that he was driving a car, and that was dangerous. I'm sure that the kids didn't like to ride with him all that much, but at least the story goes that he was driving along, had a couple of kids with him, and wanted to make a right turn. Back in those days, you didn't have turn signals, so you had to put your arm out.
Well, Grandpa was ready to turn left, and he just, he took his fist and just shoved it out the window, and the window wasn't open.
And he got to the point where he was ready to turn. He threw his arm out, forgot that the window was not down.
And it went on out.
And put the window right out.
Just to show you how austere Grandpa was and proper, he made all his girls wear long white stockings under their dresses, and they had long dresses. But when Kay's mother would get down the street, she'd roll them down around her ankles. And one day he caught her doing that and went to school and brought her home to pull her stockings up. So he was extremely proper about the demeanor of his children.
The Austin brothers, which was grandfather and his brothers, owned large herds of sheep and lots of other property. They owned Saratoga and Lehigh, and they owned a number of other things which made, they were quite a well-off operation at that time. But they hit an economic downturn, and things began to kind of fall apart for the Austin brothers. And they had a corporate meeting where they all got together. Well, at that time, grandfather was the secretary. And they began pointing fingers here and there during this meeting. And so one of the brothers suggested or said that, hey, I bet Mark is really, living high off the hog from what he's taken out of the company, or words like that, something like that. And grandfather took great pride in being able to stand up and say, I have not had so much as a postage stamp from this company. His honesty was renowned. I mean, his word was his bond. He was that school where you want a contract with him, you can shake his hand and you got it.
Grandpa was very instrumental in planning the highway from, I heard, from Idaho Falls Idaho Falls area up to Yellowstone Park. Some said that he actually planned it out of Salt Lake, and maybe that was so.
In 1910, Mark Austin became stake president up in Idaho, and he was now very busy being the stake president and also working the sugar beet industry up there. And so Mariah mentioned that he was gone a lot of the time, and that left her to her own devices to figure out what to do. And she didn't hesitate to find interesting and exciting things to do. One of the things she used to do was to hold parties in her house, and they would have popcorn and other goodies that they would have at parties, and they would get together, and she would actually read her children maybe 3 chapters out of a good book that she would pick out, and they'd all gather around her, and she'd sit and read these stories to her or to them. And also she would go to the activities that were available there. She would go to what is now Brigham Young University, Idaho or something, but that was an academy originally. And so she says she would go over to the academy, and she would go to musical performances, and she would go to plays, and they were all, she'd watch the sports activities and all that sort of thing. And she had a very busy, happy life.
I have a little book here called Gathered in Time, Utah Quilts and Their Makers, from the settlement to 1950. And in it are 2 pages devoted to a quilt made by Maria Vaughan Austin in 1938. And accompanying it, this article, a little paragraph here that you may find interesting. Although it began as a kit, the quilt became an original as Maria added buttonhole stitching to each applique piece and quilted the grid pattern in pink cotton crochet thread. She hand-pieced the border from a bright mix of yellow, pink, green, and blue fabrics. The overall effect is both playful and sophisticated, a reflection of the quilt maker that seems to say, life can be serious, but it can also be a great deal of fun.
Now, grandfather was called upon during World War I to take the presidency of Ricks College, become the acting president. I don't know for how long. I don't think it was for a terribly long time, but there was a period of time where he was the acting president. At that time, he put in place a system where the students went, my recollection, he said, in the morning, but it may have been mornings for some and afternoons for others, and studied book learning, the lectures and all that kind of thing in the class in the morning. And then he arranged for them to have jobs in the afternoon doing what they were learning in the morning. Now this was, when would this be? In the 1910, the teens, somewhere in there. And here's this system, which if you think about it, is remarkably similar to the way that doctoral students and postdoctoral students are trained today, because they go as research assistants and they spend some time in class, and then the rest of the time they work on the projects that their professors have in order to learn the real material as they're going to use it. And here was grandfather doing this in the 1910s, somewhere in there. This is particularly interesting because he didn't have a lot of education. I don't know exactly how much, but it was not a great deal. So he was working from native intelligence.
An indication of how busy Mark Austin was can be seen from this yearbook from, it's called Rexida for the Ricks College later on. I guess it was Academy at this time, but you can see here in this picture that Mark Austin was the president of the board at what became Ricks College. In 1925, Mark was requested by his company to come to Salt Lake City and become the general superintendent of agriculture. And they stayed in Salt Lake City for the rest of their lives.
Okay, in 1929, Grandpa was named a member of the General Sunday School Board.
When I was a young boy, they lived in Sugar House, in a little house in Sugar House, quite small, and that's where we went to visit them. And we could go over to Sugar House Park and go swimming in the swimming pool and what have you.
In 1936, Grandpa was called to serve on the General Church Welfare Committee. This was being organized by Elder Melvin J. Ballard and Elder Harold B. Lee. And he had a great deal of input into that and in the establishment of this welfare program, and helped it get going all throughout the West.
He had some experience in Idaho that made it a basis for him being that connected with the welfare program. So he was Mr. Welfare Program in the church at that time, and the result of that was that he did a lot of traveling with the general authorities of the church. So the president or the counselors or the apostles would go out, and Grandpa would be the one that was with them, and he would be speaking at the state conferences.
When I was 3 or 4 years old, I was a kind of a precocious child, and I liked my grandma Austin so much, and she lived what I thought was close by, so I decided I was going to walk down to her place by myself at the age of 3 or 4. And so off I trotted down the sidewalk and hippity hop, skippity skip, and after I did that, as I was walking along, I figured I knew just exactly where to go to get to Grandma's house, and so down the sidewalk I was going, and I heard somebody call my name, and I looked over, and there was a car there on the road, coming down the road on the same side that I was on, and it had just come to a stop, and there was Grandma. I couldn't believe it. There she was. And she says, "John, come and get in the car." So I ran in and hopped in the car with Grandma, and I discovered later on that my mother had found me missing and had called Grandma and said, "Grandma, I think that John's gone off down the sidewalk to visit you. Could you run down? I haven't got a vehicle right now. Can you run down the road and get him?"
I was probably 4 to 5 years old when John hooked his arm on a wrought iron railing around our porch, fell and broke his arm. And Grandma rushed over to take him to the doctor. Well, of course, she was quite excited at that time, and that was a pretty thrilling ride for Mom. Grandma was kind of noted for the thrilling rides that she provided in her car.
I remember how tall he was and how short Grandma was. She was only 4'11", and yet she was the boss. And she was kind of sassy, just a sweetheart. She just, she didn't take everything you said. She had her own ideas about what should be. They were very sweet together.
I say everybody knows I'm her favorite grandson, but all the cousins say the same thing. He made you feel special.
And I also remember the Thanksgiving meals, and we would have to go get things out of the spring house because that's where they had instead of a refrigerator. But we all had good times at Grandma's house. Loved them a lot. We had a lot of fun times. At their house we would go to have dinner, and whenever we saw Grandpa, he always gave us a dime out of his pocket.
We had the whole family with the kids and everything, and she had tables, big tables and that. And that was very special. And one thing that she did for the dinner was she always made plum pudding, and then us girls would spend part of the afternoon wrapping little coins in wax paper, and we put them in a little bowl. And then when it was time for dessert, then the little pieces of coins would go under the pudding. And my grandfather was such a big, tall, handsome man, but he used to take his false teeth out and put them in his pocket up here. And so when it was his turn to be served as dessert, he couldn't taste it. So he put the coin and the wax paper and everything right in his mouth and sort of gummed it down, and all the kids were going, "Grandpa, Grandpa, Grandpa, you're eating the money." And he went right on. He just did the whole thing. And so we spent the rest of the dinner giggling, of course. Fran and I used to get sent away from the table all the time for giggling so much.
I saw Grandpa often, and I don't ever remember seeing him not dressed up with a tie and a shirt, a white shirt, and a coat. That was just how he was. And he was tall, but he never stooped over. I don't know anyone that stood straighter and taller than he did.
One of the things that I remember about Grandma and Grandpa is they always came out for holidays and special times, and one of them was for Memorial Day. And we'd all meet out at Mom's and Dad's, and then we'd, car after car, go down to Lehigh to decorate the graves, and we always took a picnic lunch with us. And then after we'd get through decorating the graves, we'd go over to Saratoga and have our picnic lunch and go swimming. So, and we did that every year, and that was a real fun thing to do with Grandma and Grandpa. Oh, going to Lehigh and trying to find all of the graves and decorating the graves, and we'd all just have so much fun doing that, and collecting flowers, of course, before we left. And then we would go over and we would get to go swimming at Saratoga, and they had an inside pool and they had an outside pool, and of course we kids always liked the inside pool because they had a big swing ring that would hang from the ceiling, and we'd get to swing on that ring and fall into Grandpa and Dad's arms.
But we were kind of sassy too, because the streetcar came out as far as 39th South on Highland Drive. And we would go sit on the track and not let it go clear to the end. So we kind of got, you know, part of Grandma's sassiness.
He was kind of intimidating because he was very tall and rather stern. And I remember that when they was living on Highland Drive and in Sugar House both, as kids, we used to wear shorts, you know, and play and everything. And so if we went in to visit Grandma and Grandpa, and we girls had shorts on, cute little Grandma would go and get one of Grandpa's coats in the middle of the summer and wrap them around us so Grandpa couldn't see that we were wearing shorts, because he didn't like that at all.
I can remember Great-Grandpa Austin because he was so tall and rugged looking, even though he was elderly. I can remember him shaving in a pan of water with a straight razor. And I just was fascinated at that. I had never seen it, but he tolerated me. And as I sat and watched him shave in his bedroom.
Grandpa always was a real presence. You just had to kind of stop and pay attention whenever he entered a room.
Went to put on his shirt, he had a collar, a white collar that was all starched and everything that he would button onto the rest of the shirt. I guess it's so you could wear your shirt a couple of times, but the collar could be new and starched each time. So it was a very nice experience, that memory, as well as their home. I got to sleep on the couch. I can remember Great-Grandma Austin and Ruby as they were tucking me in and making sure I would be comfortable and wouldn't fall off the couch, and to make sure that I wouldn't. They even put chairs up against the couch so that I was safe and sound.
And he likes to talk, I guess sort of like I do. I'm kind of a talker too.
He was very gregarious and outgoing.
The first memory I have, I wanted to say about Grandma, and it was the car that my grandfather always had a pretty car for her, and she would dress up in her cute little hat and her gloves and drive her car. Because she was so tiny, she had to have pedals, little square blocks put on the pedals, and then she couldn't see over, so she would look through the big steering wheel. Was about this big on that car, and she'd look through there to see where she was going.
And the next thing I was thinking about is when I was about 19, I went to live with Grandpa and Grandma because I worked for the telephone company and I had to be within the city limits. So I stayed with Grandma and Grandpa for a little while. The telephone company was not the greatest place in the world to work because I had to work late at night and 4 o'clock in the morning, all that. So I didn't keep that job too long, but I did enjoy my visit with Grandpa and Grandma. I lived in their basement, and we had sheets put up on the clotheslines to make a little room for me. And I especially remember Grandpa sitting in the chair with his newspaper like this, but he'd look over at the newspaper every once in a while to see what we were doing.
Grandma stayed in the background quite often, taking care of Ruby, and she wasn't subservient, but she just kind of followed him.
Oh, she was dull. Tiny little thing, and they told you about the big LaSalle car that they had. Well, they came out to our home, and we lived out on Highland Drive, and we lived down a long lane, and there was a circle that you would drive around, and we had eaten our dinner, and we had gone out, and Grandpa when he was ready to go, he was ready to go, and he'd go and open the door for Grandma, and he'd walk around and get in. Well, Grandma was so little, and those running boards were really, really high, so she had a tough time getting in. But he would get in and start the car, and whether Grandma was all the way in or not, he'd take off down that lane with Grandma hanging on for dear life.
Oh, she was cute and fun. She was so fun, and she was always kind of giggly and laughing with us, and she was fun. Just lots of fun to be around. And she was fun to live with. She buddied with me and made it real special while I was there.
When I started school, I had to walk a mile to school, and I would pass Grandma and Grandpa's house every day. And so Grandma insisted that I stop and say hello to her every day. And so I did. And as a consequence of that, I'd get a little treat to take on to school, and sometimes she gave me things to give to the teachers. That was a little embarrassing for me, so I was not too good about that.
When I stayed with her, she lived in Sugar House, and on weekends we'd walk over to the theater in the evenings and go to the movie, she and Ruby and I.
Well, they had a big dance that everybody went to, so the folks decided, okay, they hadn't been out for a long time, they hadn't done anything, they really wanted to do something. So they went to the dance, and I was babysitting at home. Well, Grandma called in the middle of this. Now, at that time, phones were not all that well established, and so I picked up the phone and said hello in a very businesslike way, and Grandma was very pleased to talk to me and surprised to find that nobody was home but me and the other littler kids. And she always made mention of that for a number of years afterwards because the conversation had gone so well. And that was kind of nice. That was her character, because she made you feel special.
Okay, in 1940, Grandpa was called by and set apart by President Heber J. Grant to be a counselor in the Salt Lake Temple presidency, a counselor to Stephen L. Chipman.
Grandpa was in the temple when we were married, and he married us. And it was very special to go in that room and have him be the ordinance worker. And Grandma was a cute ordinance worker. She was so cute, and she hauled me around all through the temple, introducing me to everybody. I remember that really, really well. That was great fun.
I came into this family in 1943. Fran said 1942, but she's trying to make it longer than it is. 1943, we were married by Mark Austin, in the Salt Lake Temple. Prior to that time, I had some very interesting contacts with him. Fran indicated that she lived in their home for a while she was at the telephone company, and I got to date her from that house a couple of times under Grandpa's inspection. And as Bernice, I think, said, things were white and dark. There was no in between. And grateful that I passed. I claimed the honor at that point of being a returned missionary, so I guess I slipped through on a few things. But they were wonderful people. And I have great respect for this family, and am proud to be, even if it's by adoption, to be a part of it.
He used to call me his little missionary girl. And I'd say, no, I'm not a missionary girl, Grandpa. And he still insisted on calling me that. And as it turned out, I did go on a mission. I went to New York and came home, and so I was his missionary girl.
Grandpa was always very spiritual, very straight arrow. There was no gray road. There was either black or white, and he felt like things needed to be done and done right. Grandma was a little more liberal. She would joke with you and kid with you, but it was always fun.
When I came home, I worked up at Fort Douglas. It was during World War II. And I worked in the Foreign Intelligence Office, which was really an interesting but kind of sad place to work because we knew so much about what was going on. But he didn't like it because I worked there. He said that those people that I was working for in the Army were not nice people, and that he didn't want me to work there. And but I did. So they weren't bad at all.
Everything was white and black, and this is during the World War II. I was in Hawaii at the time of Pearl Harbor when the Japanese struck. Grandpa Austin was convinced that the reason that we were destroyed at Pearl Harbor is because we were so wicked. Lila indicated how wicked he thought Fort Douglas was, and he was convinced that the soldiers and sailors in Honolulu were all in brothels on the morning of December the 7th. He would sit to the side of me, and we'd talk about world things, and then he'd give me a little nudge on the knee, and he'd say, "Tell me, Newell, isn't it true that on Sunday morning when the Japanese struck, all those soldiers and sailors were in the brothels on Hotel Street in Honolulu?" I'd always hesitate because I hated to cross Grandpa. But I said, "No, Grandpa, that's not true. There were some there, that's true, but there were some very fine people." I said, "Do you know that Captain Benyon, who was one of the finest high priests we had in Honolulu at the time, and he was captain of the Arizona, he went down with his ship. He was aboard ship that morning." There'd be a silence for a few minutes, and we'd talk about something else. Then pretty soon he'd hit me on the knee again and say, "Tell me, Newell, isn't it true?" And we'd go through the same conversation again. He was trying to convert me that this is the way it was.
When I was in school a few years later, why, the gift was a very nice agate taw. And these were hard to come by, and they were quite expensive for that time. And I prized that thing. My friends were always trying to figure out some way to get it off of me. And she had that ability to choose something that really fit with where you were and what you were doing at that time, and she really made you feel special.
He came by himself fairly often, and one thing he did is he always enjoyed my mother's bread. He just, if anybody started praising anyone's homemade bread, he used to say, "Have you tasted Lillian's bread?" And he just thought that it was like, he always talked about it as just as if it was the best piece of cake in the world.
I got a sinus infection. And so I went into the children's hospital for about a month. And it was pretty unpleasant. But finally they concluded that, okay, I'm going to survive, and everything's going to go all right. But I had to go and recover. And so Grandma brought me in. Now, I stayed for a month and a half to 2 months there. And Grandma largely looked after me too. When the chips were down, she was there.
I was just a young boy, and my dad, who was the bishop, I guess by then I was in my early teens. So saying young boy, I was in my early teens by then. But my dad would come down because he had tickets to General Conference. And we'd stay with Grandma and Grandpa Austin, and then we'd get up and head to the tabernacle early in the morning, and there was 3 days of conference, and Grandpa always took me with him for some reason. Well, the reason was that Grandpa had a special seat. He was a member of the church welfare committee. He'd go up on his seat, up on the stand. I could see him sitting up on the stand with the other brethren, and I'd be probably on one of the first rows in the tabernacle, sitting right at the feet of the brethren, which is the first real experience I had with General Conference, and got me extremely interested in always listening to General Conference and attending as much as I could.
While we're in Star Valley, we went through, of course, World War II, and just at the end of World War II, I guess the war was over at that time, so that would put it in probably the war in Europe or the war completely. So it's like 44, 45 kind of time frame. Grandpa came up, and he and Dad invested in a piece of property in Star Valley. This was a farm. People had let the house go to rack and ruin, and the farm wasn't in terribly great shape either. And they thought, it was a reasonable location, and they thought, well, maybe we can do something with this. So they went in. Well, of course, the do something was that Grandpa at 4 a.m. would come down and get my brothers and I up to go work on this house, on this farm. Oh, man. Here's a 75-year-old guy, and he's coming down, running us kids ragged.
Got talking to me and one of my best friends, Burton Winters. And when Grandpa started talking, you better not be in a hurry to go anywhere or be anywhere, because Grandpa just kept you going on a very interesting story, and you couldn't get a word in edgewise. Poor Burton couldn't get home. He had to go home, but he didn't get home till a little bit later because Grandpa was talking to me and Burton.
Turned out that there was a reason for the money to be used elsewhere in the family, and so it was decided that the farm would be sold and so forth. At the time when that happened, Grandpa made a point that I knew that the profit from that sale was to go to Dad, and that all he took out was his original investment.
Grandpa came to Star Valley where he was interested in what I was doing as far as taking care of my own cow. I had a cow which I was able to have any milk that was left over after supplying what the family needed. They let me have the leftover milk, which I sold all over town. Did quite well, and Grandpa had to have an accounting for all that. He was doing a little checking up on his grandson.
I have here an interesting family treasures. It's a little book called 101 Famous Poems. That was the possession of Mark and Maria Austin. And inside is an inscription. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, December the 25th, 1923. President and Mrs. Mark Austin, dear brother and sister Austin. Please accept this copy of 101 famous poems with the best wishes of Sister Grant and myself, that you and your dear ones may have a very enjoyable Christmas and a happy and prosperous New Year.
Grandma was an angel. She was one who was tested with a special test by having my Aunt Ruby, who had a high fever when she was very young, and her growth, really her mental growth stopped at about 4, maybe 5 years old, I guess. And Grandma had to have an awful lot of patience with Ruby, because Ruby could enter into a conversation very naturally and very quickly and just monopolize it, and Grandma had to help to control that. It was kind of hard for her.
But once in a while, Ruby would kind of get on Grandma's nerves a little bit, I remember, because Grandma would have some friends in that she wanted to chat with a little bit, and as she talked, Ruby would repeat everything she said. She'd parrot it. Every time she'd say something, Ruby would parrot it, and then Grandma would say something else, and Ruby would parrot it. She'd say, "Ruby, you've got something you need to do in your bedroom," and she'd send her back there to make her bed or do something so she could have a little peace as she talked to her friend.
When I was going to the University of Utah after high school, but before my mission, I had, through the good offices of Mark Schwendeman, got a job in Sugar House. He was living, of course, in the basement of Grandma and Grandpa at this time.
Mark got out of the service in 1946, so that's when we moved in. We needed a place to live, and $30 then sounds it was a bargain, but it was a darling apartment. He had renters in it, but he asked them to leave. He was such a joyous part of our family with these funny little antics and such, and it's just a treat that we had 5 years to live there and, you know, get to know them. And then his hearing got very bad as he got older, and so a joke that the whole family talked about, he had a big black car, not sure what the make was, but he would go out in the driveway and he couldn't hear it accelerate, and so he would push on it till it sounded like he was going to go through the neighbor's house. As he backed out, he would just shoot out of the driveway.
Grandma insisted that I come and see her each day before I went to work. And so I was working typically 4, I think, days a week, maybe 5 days a week. And so I was seeing Grandma 4 or 5 days a week. Grandpa decided that it was telling on her, that you know, remember, she was now, she was in her 80s, I think, by this time. Her response was, "He's my grandson and I'll feed him if I want. Now you just leave me alone."
And I was always running back and forth with 50 cows to go in an hour and a half. You didn't stop running. But Grandpa would walk up and down and follow me in that inside ramp. He disturbed the cows because they weren't used to having some big, tall, giant man walking up and down in the middle. But he would talk loud so that I'd be sure and hear what he was saying, and we carried on a conversation as I milked and changed milking machines on those 50 cows. He loved to be there. In fact, I think sometimes he stayed over so that he could be sure and go and look at all those cows.
I remember arriving in Salt Lake City and calling Grandpa's office. The voice on the other end of the phone was from the Deep South, that low, romantic female voice. In the deep Southern accent, the voice spoke to me.
"You and I, sugar."
I hung up the phone, asking to dial Grandpa again. I repeated this 3 times until Grandma figured out my game. To finish this story, Grandpa had selected these girls from the South.
"You and I, sugar." "You and I, sugar." "You and I, sugar."
For the express purpose of getting the reaction he created in his grandson. 60 years later, it is still one of my favorite memories. "You and I, sugar."
And then Grandma made the best eggs I've ever eaten, I think. And I don't like eggs very well, but she made these wonderful eggs. It was more like a custard than an egg. And she just put the egg in and the milk in and a little bit of sugar, I think. And anyway, then she stirred it very gently. And anyway, it ended up like a custard instead of scrambled eggs.
He knew those cows better than I did. I had a book on each one, and I think before he got through with those cows, he knew them better than I.
Remember once when she came to my house, and my husband had just given me a pair of green sandals with big, thick soles and double ankle straps. And she put them on. She wanted to try them on, and she clomped around the house, and I don't know how she kept them on because she was so tiny, and the shoes were as big as she was.
He was a little disturbed. I had one Holstein, and all the rest of them were beautiful Guernseys, and he did not like that Holstein, and neither did I. The Holstein was mean. She'd kick the milker off. She'd do all kinds of mean things, and Grandpa couldn't understand why we kept that cow.
I remember the eggs that Fran was talking about, and the one eggs that Grandma used to fix that I remember, she made them a good deal like you would make an omelet, you know, beating them up, but then she would put them in glass dishes and bake them in the oven.
Well, what we have found in that Austin book, I think, is so precious about the handwritten notes he wrote to the president of the church and the apostles, and they answered him. He was always writing letters. He often brought them down. We had a typewriter, and so he'd write them out, and Mark or I'd type them up for him.
He was in the temple presidency, and he arranged for President McKay to marry Harvey and I.
Grandpa only charged us $30 a month to stay in that apartment, but he sent that $30 to Michael on his mission. He never touched it. It just went directly to Michael on his mission.
Grandmother and grandfather's eating habits were kind of interesting. Normally they ate normal food. We'd go there sometimes for Thanksgiving dinner or a reunion, and the food they had there was great, and the food that grandmother was preparing was great. But I remember one occasion where I went there, and she prepared something for me which is a southern delicacy, and unfortunately I've lost the name, something like crackling or something like that. But anyway, what it consists of is a daub of fat, fried until it's just super crisp, and then you eat it. Now I understand that such a thing is still available in the South as a delicacy, but she did this and offered me some, and I didn't want it. I have a reaction to fat. I don't like it much, but okay, we tried it, and I got to admit it did taste pretty good.
I could use that bedroom after Jolene was born because the sun came in, so when she was so little, I'd take her in and lay her on the bed so the sun would get at her. And if you looked up through the basement window, here was Grandpa sitting, waving to her by the hour if she was there. And she couldn't wave back, but he got such enjoyment out of looking at her through that window and waving to her. One thing about Grandma, and I think we all remember, is her cute little hats. They were always perched right on top of her head. And she was so sweet and so teeny. And if he held his arm out, she could fit right in his armpit. She fit right under him. You can tell from some of the pictures. And he was always very much in charge. And one fun thing he did was we lived just a block south of 21st South, which then wasn't as busy as it is now. But he would take walks and cross over 21st South, and he didn't bother with the lights or anything. He just held his hand up and had the cars stop. And they were afraid he'd never make it because he just didn't think rules were for him. He just knew everybody would stop for him.
I'll always remember Grandpa called and wanted to have some mason jars to do some canning in. So Kay's mother packed up a box of mason jars, and we took him out to the car. He was driving a great big black car, and she told him to open the trunk, and he thought she said go. And he went to lift She went to lift the mason jars in the trunk of the car, and he took off, and they dropped on the street and broke all the pieces, and he just kept right on going.
But if he wanted 2 or 3 times a week, as we'd come up out of the apartment and go toward the car, he'd be standing there in his suit and tie and hat to ride with us. He didn't ever ask, he just stood there waiting for us. But we only had a one-seated car, and so I was in the middle of these 2 men, and he had a way of accentuating his sentences by using his elbow. And by the time we'd get to town, I'd almost be underneath Mark, because Grandpa had talked all the way and pushed me. And Mark would get laughing. I mean, and Grandpa couldn't hear, so he didn't know we were laughing at him.
After my grandmother died, he was alone for a while, and he missed going down and being with people because he would love to be at the temple. And he used to go into the Hotel Utah, which is now the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. And he would go and sit in the lobby, and he would wait for people he knew to come through so that he could talk to them. The minute he saw one, he was up and going over and shaking hands and sitting and talking. He did that almost every day. And
Grandma Austin was always in the background. She never was a person to put herself forward, but a very humble, sweet, and very charitable individual.
Grandpa, like everybody says, was always there, but not really into the fun and frivolity that went on.
Well, he talked in church a lot. And I remember especially the time that he came to our ward and gave a nice talk, and he went on and on and on and on. Well, he was talking about the world and how things were going, and past time for it to be over. And all of a sudden he looked up at the clock and he said, "It's a damn mess. God bless you. Amen." You know, the time's up. He just left. It was really funny, and of course everybody laughed.
But he had so many cute ways about him. The one that we all remember is he held so many high positions in church that he was very used to sitting on the stand. And so even when we were living there, through 46 to 51, why, he still was going up during meeting and sitting on the stand, and he held no position, but they never asked him not to sit there. I mean, he felt very comfortable sitting on the stand.
But he had a beautiful spirit about him.
But he just got so engrossed in what he was doing that he didn't think of anything else. He just could shut things out. And I think that's how that very formal kind of thing impressed us all, that he didn't quite get down to our level in that regard, but commanded respect.
I was always kind of in awe of being around him, and except when he was looking over his newspaper. That used to just tickle me. I thought that was so much fun.
He was really proud of his house. He raised chickens. He had a little brooder out in the garage, and he'd buy the eggs and hatch them and raise them, and then they'd eat them later on. But that was one of his little hobbies, and his gardening. And he had pansies in the front yard that to him were the most beautiful flower, because they all looked like they had little faces, and he was always taking you out to show you these pansies with their faces.
The way he dressed was the way he was, or the way we perceived him to be. And I'm sure there was a more genteel side that maybe we, but let me tell you, he treated Grandma like a queen. And he just carried her around in great esteem. Well, you felt it when you were with him, that she was special. And she was special. She was special to us. So we got a little better acquainted with Grandma than we did with Grandpa, because of his just being a little more formal.
I have my own version of why we all mentioned, I think, during our talks about Grandpa, why we were kind of intimidated by him and thought he was really special, and we're a little bit afraid of him. even though he was such a sweet man. But I think it was because he had this bushy mustache that just kind of went up like this and down, and we would like to watch it move, and when he smiled and everything.
And she loved to bake pies, and it made her so furious because when Grandpa would eat the pie, he'd eat the filling and leave the shell. And so one day she decided to trick him. And so she made pumpkin pie, but she didn't put in a shell. She just let it form in the pie plate. And he ate it, and he turned to her and said, "Mariah, that's the best crust you've ever made." And she said, "I never did tell him." So from then on, she didn't bother to put the pie crust.
He used to eat some unusual things, one of which was that he had his famous 30-second egg. He would put an egg in boiling water for 30 seconds, and take it out, crack it into a glass, stir it up, and then drink it.
We always knelt around the table for family prayer and to have a blessing on the food. We did that both at night and in the morning when we were there, you know, like if we had stayed for the week or whatever. I remember we always said the blessing and had a family prayer. Grandpa was really strict about something like that.
We were very excited when Grandma and Grandpa were coming over to see us. So they were wonderful, sweet people.
One of the things that really bothered her toward her last years is her heart got bad, and the doctor insisted she had to have a little sip of wine, you know, in the morning to stimulate her heart. Well, she knew she was going, you know where. She wasn't going to go to heaven after that, but she did it.
They kept in contact with Dad and Mom in letter telling us of how she was doing, and I remember I used to read those letters. It was quite sad to read how Grandma was gradually failing, and she got to at one point there where she didn't really know anyone that was coming to visit her, and it was sad. This sweet little angel of a lady was gradually failing, and it was kind of a blessing when she was able to leave this world and go on.
The service was conducted by Bishop Troffer of the Lincoln Ward in the Lincoln Ward Chapel. And the main speaker at the service was President J. Reuben Clark Jr., first counselor to President George Albert Smith.
When she died, why, Ruby's hair was a little bit of a problem, and so Grandpa would have Ruby wash her hair, and then she would come down, and I'd put curlers in it and curl it for her.
He was a very proud person, not in the sense that he put others down, but very self-confident and a very proud person.
One thing about Grandpa, you never saw him without a shirt and tie and a suit jacket if he was going to leave the house. But he was always dressed like he was going to Sunday meeting.
He told me at one time that Zions Bank had somehow in their processes come up with $1 million of surplus that they were looking to invest. And they said, "We'd like you to take it for us and invest it." Now he was 75, 80 at this time. And he elected not to do it, but he took quite a lot of pride in the fact that they would come to him and say such a thing.
He was busy right to the end. Along with his agricultural expertise, he became a great person to be able to work with the water problems that people had.
Grandpa got a ride with another man, and they came to Lehigh from Salt Lake to look at some property up on the foothills there where they are now building Cabela's.
And so he was down in Lehigh inspecting some ditches and canals and whatever.
And on the way back,
he talked and talked and talked and talked, and finally he stopped talking.
Grandpa laid back in the seat and appeared as though he had gone to sleep.
And my grandfather had passed away right while he was talking, and what a wonderful way to go.
Well, when they got home, this fellow could not awaken Grandpa.
And that's where he suffered a heart attack.
In December of 1948, a young writer by the name of Gordon B. Hinckley wrote an article for the Church News about Grandpa, and a very complimentary article about his life.